Thousands of indigenous protesters have now broken into the National Assembly building in Quito, Ecuador. The U.S. Supreme Court decides on the rights of gay and transgender workers. Algerians continue protesting in the capital, calling for the removal of the ruling elite. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. We begin in Ecuador, where thousands of indigenous protesters have now broken into the National Assembly building. This is a video of them inside the chamber. As we reported earlier, the demonstrators have been trying to storm the building for the last few hours as part of their protest against President Lenín Moreno's austerity package. This is the sixth day of the protest against the government's measures, which includes a sharp rise in fuel prices. Indigenous marchers from the northern and central highland region have converged on the capital, where they have been joined by students, trade unions, social movements, and ordinary citizens angry at the economic measures. During the takeover of the National Assembly, police heavily repressed protesters. As we can see in this video, paramedics are trying to take care of the critically injured. The government has now declared a curfew in the vicinity of official buildings from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Our correspondent Estefania Bravo is near the Assembly building following the takeover by indigenous protesters here in Quito, and just sent this report.
Hi, yes, thank you. We are here in the north of Quito, specifically in 12 de Octubre and Avenida Patria. And as you can tell, the situation here is very tense. Indigenous movements are still here and have been clashed by police forces. They have thrown gas bombs, and we have also felt the gas bombs. My team and I have felt the gas bombs. And it's a really crucial time here for Ecuador. What they want to do is they want to meet with President Lenín Moreno, and they are against the economic measures proposed by him. As you can tell, people are still here. It is very certain that people will stay here until tomorrow, that the general strike is called for all members of society, including the indigenous movements. So we will be here. We will continue to update you with any information that we have.
Thank you, Stefania, for that information. Earlier in the afternoon, Ecuadorian police raided an opposition radio station in the capital. Radio Pichincha Universal is owned by the opposition-run prefecture of Pichincha province and has been providing extensive coverage of the protests. The police removed the radio's equipment and it has now gone off the air. The government has cited its powers under the state of exception to justify closing the station. Protests have been ongoing since last Thursday. In light of the mobilizations, President Moreno moved his government to Guayaquil. State institutions suspended most activities on Tuesday as the school remains closed for a 4th day. The authorities announced that 570 people have been detained so far as social media continues to be flooded with images of police brutality. Indigenous marchers from the northern highlands got a very different reception when they reached the low-income neighborhood of Calderón in the north of Quito. They were cheered by local residents who had collected food and other supplies for them. And after the repression in the center of the city, the indigenous protesters from the south were also given a meal by social movements who turned out to welcome them. We stay in Ecuador, where President Lenín Moreno gave televised address late on Monday to announce he has transferred the seat of government to the city of Guayaquil after having abandoned the capital of Quito. He went on to assert that report incidents of violence indicate the protests are organized in order to bring down his administration.
Countrymen, I've moved to the city of Guayaquil, and I've also transferred the seat of government to the city in accordance with the Constitution. I've always put the peace and tranquility of Ecuadorians before my own well-being. What's happened over these days in Ecuador isn't a protest of discontent because of a government decision. The violence, vandalism, and looting shows that here there is an organized political effort to destabilize the government and an end to constitutional and democratic order.
Indigenous protesters have also arrived in the city of Guayaquil, the financial hub of Ecuador, where President Lenín Moreno has holed himself up. In recent reports, the roads leading to the city's wealthiest neighborhood have been blocked by authorities. This, as Guayaquil has also been blocked by anti-government protests in recent days.
As we didn't have any official information and the indigenous marches were coming from the highlands and there are several entrances to Guayaquil, we didn't know where they would arrive. So we protesters from the Recreo and Duran came here to the bridge. People knocked down the lampposts to block the road to cars. The police, as usual, used force, fired tear gas to stop us from moving forward and blocking the road.
Let's hear now from our correspondent in Guayaquil, Carla Gonzalez.
So we are still at the National Unity Bridge connecting Duran and Guayaquil. We are witnessing how people are starting to get a bit exacerbated. The movement of the troops, the Air Force, the military, the municipal trucks that have come here to block the entrance of the national strike, trying to enter Guayaquil, has turned people here in Duran a bit uncomfortable with their presence, so they are starting to gather around to protest, to block also the main road here. We are looking at how municipal trucks have entered since yesterday, trying to block the entrance of more protests that are trying to enter the city, and tomorrow they have planned a national strike that will see also several indigenous communities entering Quito and Guayaquil, the main cities in the country.
Thank you, Carla, for that report. In other news, Colombia's former president Álvaro Uribe is being questioned by the Supreme Court over alleged witness tampering. Protesters gathered outside the court ahead of the hearing, and they say Uribe, as a senator and the unofficial head of the governing party, is partly responsible for the murder of hundreds of community leaders and former FARC guerrillas. The case against the former president has to do with his alleged involvement with right-wing paramilitaries.
I never thought that frankly defending honor in my love for Colombia, with respect for citizens, and in accordance with the Constitution, would create these judicial difficulties for me.
A bill promoted by right-wing parties in Colombia proposes setting limits on public protests. Human rights organizations are opposing the bill as it violates constitutional and international norms.
Demonstrations like this are a target of security bodies belonging to the Colombian government. The defense minister and the interior minister agree that social movements must be regulated by means of a bill that will be presented by right-wing political parties in Congress and that aims at setting limits on public demonstrations.
We need to create punitive measures for social protests because the way public forces are attacked isn't appreciated by citizens. Civil servants are ridiculed. In some cases, they try to set them on fire and attack them with all kinds of tools, and in some cases with firearms. This requires punitive measures.
Human rights organizations argue that if this project were to be adopted, it would be violating Colombia's political constitution. They say the bill is actually seeking to provide ways to violently suppress all sorts of protests, as well as stigmatize social movements that are growing in the country.
If we are going to talk about building a constitutional norm or any other kind of norm about protest, it must be one that guarantees protests can take place and that they are not limited or criminalized, and one that doesn't promote police violence.
One of the most controversial aspects of this project is the possibility that under the presumption of acts of violence or vandalism, public forces may force their way into educational institutions, something that, according to the educational community, violates the principle of university autonomy. Meanwhile, the students' community is also demanding investigations into the anti-riot squad after the death of students during protests.
The student movements have specifically had to endure many murders. At the hands of the SMAT, student leaders like in the case of Oscar Salas, who was murdered inside this university by a non-conventional weapon used by the SMAT during a confrontation.
In the next days, the project aiming at regulating demonstrations in Colombia will be presented in Congress for debate and approval. Meanwhile, students have been protesting, saying that on October 10th, they will mobilize on the streets to request the abolishment of the anti-riot squad and the investigation of acts of corruption inside public universities.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. The U.S. auto giant General Motors is temporarily laying off another 446 workers in Mexico because of the strike by its workers in the United States. Last week, GM suspended 6,000 workers at its Silao assembly and transmission plant in Guanajuato, central Mexico. The latest layoffs are in its engine plant in Ramon Arcipe. 48,000 members of the United Auto Workers Union went on strike across the United States on September 16th. Talks with management are said to be deadlocked. Our correspondent in Mexico City, Eduardo Martinez, has the details.
According to the latest update, about 446 General Motors workers in Mexico have been fired as a result of a strike by workers from the same company in the United States, which has been going on for a month by now. The majority of workers are deployed at the company's Ramos Arizpe factory in the north of Mexico. GM previously laid off 6,000 workers in Mexico at a separate facility in Silao, Mexico. At the end of September, the company announced that a good portion of the workers in Mexico are obliged to take out vacations, and they will only receive 55% of their salaries during this time. The GM strike in the U.S. affects about 6,000 GM workers in Mexico. Car components make up one of the biggest portions of Mexico's export market. The Mexican government hasn't taken address the worker situation so far.
Thank you, Eduardo, for that report. Moving on, with a general election due next year, Trinidad and Tobago's government has presented what many are calling a sweetheart budget. The 53 billion TT dollar fiscal package was delivered by Finance Minister Cole Imber on Monday. He announced an increase in the minimum wage from $15 to $16 per hour starting from December 2019. Persons employed in the state community enhancement programs also got a 15% pay hike. Farming will become a tax-free industry with all fees and duties on all inputs for farmers to be removed. And a ban on the importation of styrofoam in the food industry and the use of plastic water bottles in government offices will take effect at the start of 2020.
I now propose that daily paid workers in the public service with an appropriate minimum length of service be eligible for the minimum public service pension of $3,500 per month. I propose to offer, in the first instance, $3 billion in interest-bearing government bonds.
And the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce has mixed reactions to the budget. While the powerful business lobby is pleased with most of the measures, it's concerned about the government's failure to put a cap on crime, which continues to be a major obstacle to business activity in Trinidad and Tobago.
While we have seen positive elements since the Commissioner Guy Griffith assumed his position, there is still a perception that Trinidad and Tobago is not a safe country. This is mainly due to the high murder rate that currently exists. Allocations in the national security has been increased over time. However, crime does not seem to be declining. The Minister announced the purchase of several pieces of equipment to expand the operational plan to fight crime. If we want to see improved foreign investment, we must see positive results on these initiatives, as companies want a safe country to invest and operate.
Meanwhile, an opposition leader, in her response to the 2019-2020 budget, told the government that the country needs jobs.
How to create new revenue streams and create new jobs and foreign exchange. That is what we should have heard here today. That is what the Minister should have been telling us today. How do we create jobs? What am I going to do as Minister of Finance for job creation, for revenue generation, and for forex issues to be dealt with?
Jamaica's Prime Minister Andrew Holness has stated that the small island developing states, or SIDS, are under immediate threat of climate change. He made the comment while giving the keynote address at the GCF Private Investment for Climate Conference in South Korea on Monday. PM Holness made a clear point that more must be done to tackle the crisis.
Climate-related shocks, whether sharp and swift hurricanes or lingering and debilitating droughts, have a long-term effect, particularly on the economic growth trajectory and public debt of small island developing states and less developed countries. The problem is compounded by the fact, as you all know, that small island developing states, notwithstanding that by virtue of size, we are the least cause of the problem, but by virtue of our geography, we are among the most vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. But we are also, by virtue of the state of development of our economy and public institutions, we are amongst the least able to respond.
Guyana's President David Granger says the protection of indigenous land, languages, and other rights remains a priority of his government. Granger issued the assurance while addressing over 200 village leaders at the opening of the National Tocheos Council. The council is the highest representative body for indigenous peoples. There are 9 indigenous nations that settle across the 10 administrative regions in Guyana. President Granger urged Tocheos village leaders to set aside their differences and come together to reduce some of the social problems threatening their communities.
Work together to reduce the incidence of alcoholism, incest, murder, non-communicable diseases, people trafficking, prostitution, substance abuse, teenage pregnancy and suicide in certain communities. Antisocial behavior undermines the cultural fabric of communities and lowers everyone's quality of life.
In other news, Honduras opposition and social forces are coming together to demand the resignation of President Juan Orlando Hernandez. U.S. prosecutors say jailed Mexican drug lord Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán gave $1 million to the brother of Honduran president, a bribe that was meant to reach the country's leader for campaign financing.
President Hernandez, who enjoys the staunch support of the Trump administration, has said the accusations were less serious than Alice in Wonderland. But prosecutors in New York tell a different story. They allege that El Chapo personally gave the money in bribes to Juan Antonio Tony Hernandez, the president's brother, who in turn used his government connections to smuggle U.S.-bound cocaine through Honduras.
It's devastating for a country when its president is being accused of scheming against an entire institutional structure that allowed drug trafficking to take place from South to North of America.
After the first hearings against Tony Hernandez, Honduras Attorney General and the Supreme Court have failed to say whether any investigation would be launched into the allegations against the Honduran president and his brother.
There has been no answer from the state attorney so far. There are no answers neither from the armed forces nor the police. They're just silent. This is what's happening right now in the country, and it's so unfortunate because the Honduran people are the ones who's suffering.
Various opposition forces are starting to mobilize. And now they are calling for mass protest action to demand the resignation of Juan Orlando Hernandez and his co-conspirators.
As a result of this, opposing political and social forces are calling for the people to exercise their right to protest until the narco dictatorship falls down. We will let you know the details in time.
Interests from various social and political sectors have been mobilizing to hold mass protests against Juan Orlando Hernandez's government.
There's been major uncertainty in our country. The entire opposition needs to join forces. We can't have a leader who's been accused of drug trafficking by the New York Southern District Attorney. I believe that Juan Orlando Hernandez's resignation is crucial for the entire country.
The president has been labeled a co-conspirator, though he has not been charged. During the trial against his brother, former mayor Alexander Ardon testified that the president received funds that facilitated drug trafficking, while providing protection to Ardon and his family.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. back. LGBTQ activists have gathered outside the United States Supreme Court as it weighs on case about the rights of gay and transgender workers. The Supreme Court has to rule on whether gay and transgender workers are protected under anti-discrimination laws, an issue which has caused deep divisions within the U.S. society. The Title VII of the Civil Rights Act forbids employers from discriminating against employees on the basis of sex, as well as race, color, national origin, and religion. Algerians have protested once again on the capital, Algiers, demanding the removal of the ruling elites. The protesters condemned the presence of security forces and arrests during demonstrations. The latest demonstration in Algiers was sparked by an announcement that presidential elections will be held in December, which they say will favor another corrupt politician. Algerians plunged into crisis in February when people protested to stop the former president from running for a fifth time. He later resigned and the election was postponed.
We went out against the elections of December 12th. I swear that we won't let them happen. We don't want this regime. The military regime has to fall. We want a democratic, free, civil country.
Search operations continue for 17 missing African migrants a day after the bodies of 13 old women were recovered following the latest shipwreck off the coast of Lampedusa. Coffins were lined up on the port as bodies were brought to the shore. The migrant vessel, which was carrying more than 50 people, capsized in bad weather. 21 migrants survived the sinking of the boat, but many are still not accounted for, including 8 children. A Cameroonian survivor recalled the traumatic experience.
Among the survivors, there are only 3 boys, and the others are at the bottom of the sea. I find it hard to talk about. I feel like I'm suffocating, and I do not have the strength to explain things better. There were 2 newborns and 2 minors who fell into the sea and who did not survive. Many women died. We are 12 survivors.
The son of the South African former president Jacob Zuma has appeared before the Commission of Inquiry seeking to unearth corruption. Due to saying Zuma has been implicated as a fixer for the controversial Gupta family. This family is alleged to have a hand in making executive decisions while President Jacob Zuma was in office. Our correspondent Matuba Matache was following those proceedings.
First, it was his father, former President Jacob Zuma, in the hot seat at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. It didn't go so well, with the former president's counsel threatening to pull out of proceedings. Months later, it's now the turn of his son, Duduzane Zuma.
Mr. Tony Gupta is a business partner of mine.
Yes.
And he's also a very dear and close friend.
Zuma Jr. had to respond to allegations that he was a crucial link between government and the controversial Gupta family. Allegations leveled against him include a former deputy minister being offered a finance minister post and thousands of dollars in kickbacks if he agreed. But the young Zuma says he feels prejudiced by some questions put to him.
This was raised in the media. There was media statements put out. The man went on TV and said whatever he needed to say. I'm not taking away from why he did it. I don't know. He did what he had to do. Good for him. I have no issues with that. Now, what I'm saying is, it's the first time I'm being asked this question.
During his appearance months ago, former President Jacob Zuma also denied that the Gupta family were involved in selecting members of his cabinet. He, however, admitted that the Guptas were indeed his friends and business associates of his son Duduzane. But the young Zuma was defensive throughout the proceedings.
There were more denials than concessions in Duduzane Zuma's testimony at the State Capture Inquiry, but we expect to see more pressure being put on him as days go by, because he will be cross-examined by lawyers of people who implicated him in serious allegations of corruption. I'm Matuba Mahlachi in Johannesburg for Telesur.
We thank Matuba for that report, and we come to the end of this news brief. You can find this and many other stories in our website at telesurenglish.net. And don't forget to join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. Thank you for watching.